When the first roads were built in California, they were crude, rough, and crisscrossed through farmlands, mountains, and coastal communities, enabling horses and wagons to get to their destinations. In those early days of transportation and commerce, the simple act of getting from here to there was complicated and time-consuming. Motorized vehicles changed everything. As cars and motorcycles became more popular, the demand for more roadways created new challenges, including traffic safety and the need for rules of the road. In 1909, the California legislature directed the Department of Engineering to plan a highway system north and south through the state, traversing the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys and along the Pacific coast, joining the centers of population. In those earliest days, each county in California was responsible for their own traffic laws, and they hired their own traffic safety officers. This was often ineffective and confusing for the public. Leading up to 1920, as cars increased in popularity and more roads were being built, more was demanded of the officers, and many saw the need for better job protection and safety measures, as well as pay. So, to address such issues, a few traffic officers and police officers got together in Visalia in 1919. Out of this fateful meeting, a more cohesive effort to recruit members for a statewide association made up solely of traffic officers from counties throughout the state began. A group of traffic officers met on August 25, 1920 in Fresno to establish the San Joaquin Valley Traffic Officers Association. An attendee, George Moynihan, wrote, "The men who attended realized a supreme satisfaction in the fact that there finally existed an organization to advance the cause of traffic patrolmen." Harry Wilson, then captain of the Fresno County Motor Patrol, was elected the first president. The group, although small, got to work formulating plans and objectives and writing bylaws. Throughout the ensuing weeks, the group received numerous requests from patrol squads in the state for membership, and its founders were convinced they had made an excellent start. They met for a second time on September 15, 1920, and to signal the ever-increasing growth of the group, they changed the group's name, and the California Association of Highway Patrolmen was born. At the second annual convention on January 10, 1921, President Wilson said in his opening address that although the group was still in its infancy, they had become one of the largest groups of its kind in the nation. The California Association of Highway Patrolmen, or CAHP, continued to grow in size, structure, and influence, and in 1928 they decided to incorporate as a nonprofit organization. The Board of Directors executed Articles of Incorporation with the state on June 15, 1929. The Articles of Incorporation embraced all California traffic officers, dealt with economic aspects of the organization, placed the headquarters in Sacramento, and provided for a 9-member Board of Directors. The main purpose of the CAHP was to take care of its members and their families. The CAHP had growing clout in the California legislature, and using much of its input, the state formed the California Highway Patrol on August 14, 1929, as part of the Division of Motor Vehicles, and Eugene W. Biscaluz was the first superintendent. Most county traffic officers became CHP officers, except those in Los Angeles County, which did not yet operate as part of the CHP. At the CAHP convention in 1930, delegates decided to elect officers from the convention floor instead of having them appointed by the directors. As the membership grew rapidly, the directors voted in 1933 to purchase a group life insurance policy to cover the CAHP membership. It had become evident that it was necessary to place the death benefit to widows and orphans on a more businesslike and secure basis. Before then, the death benefit was taken care of on an "if we have the money, you can have it" basis. The CAHP worked to get the California Highway Patrol full police powers. The Young Association continued in its mission to look out for CHP officers. In 1934, a committee was formed to contact the Department of Motor Vehicles to work out a plan to adjust the salaries of all officers of the California Highway Patrol who were not receiving a salary at a rate equitable to their years of service. Many long-standing members were concerned about the possibility they might not be covered for service rendered prior to 1929, when the California Highway Patrol gained official status. That year, the State Employees Retirement Act was enacted, and members of the association were covered for all years they worked, dating back to 1923. In 1936, the directors voted to appoint a legislative representative to work with the state legislature on measures affecting the association. Prior to this decision, contact with legislators had been on an occasional basis, with no one having the specific task of representing the association in political matters. One of the biggest actions of 1936 occurred when the association went on record favoring an assembly bill requiring compulsory inspection of all automobiles. The bill was later passed, with much of the credit going to the CAHP. During that same year, the California Personnel Board recommended setting a minimum $200 a month CHP salary schedule. The CAHP applauded the action because of the advancing living costs, which had steadily increased over a considerable period of time. The California Highway Patrolman magazine was first published in March 1937 as a way for the CAHP to make money. It continued to be published through the year 2000. With more cars on the road and the population of California growing quickly, the job of a highway patrolman became more demanding and sometimes deadly. In 1942, as World War II was unfolding, there was some concern about the military status of association members. The CAHP purchased $50,000 in U.S. defense bonds. Later, they invested $60,000 in victory bonds and government bonds in 1945 and 1946. Also in 1942, the CHP hired the first African-American officer, Homer Garrett. He later went on to become a municipal court judge in Los Angeles. Wartime material shortages forced the change from long uniform coats to short Eisenhower jackets. As a result of salary problems as the war drew to a close in 1945, the association endorsed and supported a CSEA-sponsored Senate bill for a 10% pay increase for all state employees. However, the bill was tossed out, and one calling for a $25 increase across the board for highway patrolmen was passed instead. In 1947, the CHP separated from the Department of Motor Vehicles and was elevated to a Department of State Government. The Department of California Highway Patrol was established and supervised by a commissioner appointed by the governor. Governor Earl Warren appointed Clifford E. Peterson as the CHP's first commissioner. As the CAHP increased its political power, it was largely responsible for a DMV change requiring license plates on both the front and back of automobiles. It was reasoned that two plates would increase the efficiency of the CHP by making automobiles easier to identify. In 1948, the current shoulder patch was designed and adopted. In the early 1950s, the CAHP started exerting influence concerning the appointment of the CHP department head. The board recommended that an eligibility list be established and the position be filled by promotional examination, rather than being appointed by the governor. The 1950s saw many safety and technological improvements. In 1950, the CHP began using the FM radio waveband for communication. In 1951, operational zones were created. Seat belts were installed in all new CHP enforcement vehicles in 1953. In 1954, CHP tested radar for speed enforcement. Portable truck scales began to be used in 1955. In 1955, the TV show Highway Patrol, starring Broderick Crawford, started airing on TV.
These are the stories of the men whose training, skill, and courage.
Introducing the California Highway Patrol to a mass audience. The CAHP had a representative on the CHP Uniform Committee. In 1957, the current uniform style was adopted, with changes including the blue and gold pant leg stripes, blue necktie, years of service stripes, and a new hat design. CHP motorcycle officers were issued helmets for safety. Political influence of the association in 1957 resulted in a promise from CHP Commissioner Bernard Caldwell that he would push a 24-hour in-view patrol on all main highways. The idea was that if an officer were inside of a motorist, drivers would be less likely to commit traffic violations. The Winter Olympics were held in Squaw Valley, California in 1960, and the CHP served as the traffic detail. It was the first time the CHP was used in a coordinated statewide effort. Later in the 1960s, as civil unrest, protest, and riots occurred, the CHP was thrust into statewide response roles. The CAHP continued its efforts to increase the general welfare of its members through political activity in the state legislature. They successfully lobbied to assure the acceptance of two-man night patrols rather than one man, in order to provide added protection for officers in the field. and also pushed for hazardous duty pay for motorcycle officers. In 1963, the CAHP began pressing for authority to allow patrolmen to carry shotguns in CHP units. Concerned about the safety of the individual officers on duty, the directors referred the matter to the commissioner. In 1965, shotguns were installed in all CHP patrol cars. The health of all CHP officers has always been a primary concern for the CAHP, and the association pressed hard for major medical benefits for CHP members under a group Blue Cross insurance plan. In 1967, the board began plans to set up payroll deductions from membership dues and voted to use the new procedures effective January 1968. One of the major achievements of the CAHP was legislation that passed in 1968 providing $80 million in future retirement benefits for CHP officers and allowing an earlier retirement age for patrolmen. At the time, the legislation contained provisions to allow patrolmen to retire at 75% of their highest 3-year salary. The population in California exploded in the 1960s, as did the number of cars on its famous new freeways. In response, the CHP nearly doubled its number of officers between 1966 and 1968, greatly increasing the number of CAHP members at the same time. The 1970s saw many significant changes, but early on a tragic event occurred in April 1970 that changed the course of law enforcement training forever. 4 CHP officers, Walter Frago, Roger Gore, James Pinch Jr., and George M. Allen, died in what is now referred to as the Newhall incident. It led to the CHP making major changes in its training and car stop procedures, leading to enhanced training in first responder agencies worldwide that continues today. The CAHP celebrated its 50th anniversary on September 15, 1970. At that time, the CAHP Widows and Orphans Trust Fund had distributed over $932,000 to families of deceased members, fulfilling the association's mission to serve members' families. 1971 marked the beginning of a new era. CAHP representatives had to work directly with the legislature to achieve any kind of salary increase. The CAHP focused on introducing bills in the legislature that improved pay and benefits for its members, both active and retired. The big story of 1972 was the California Highway Patrol Salary Initiative, otherwise known as parity. Spurred by growing dissatisfaction over an increasing salary lag behind comparable police and sheriff's departments, the association decided to take its plight to the people. In January 1972, the CHP helped launch Proposition 16, a constitutional amendment for the November general election. It would mandate that salaries for highway patrolmen be adjusted to at least the maximum rate paid policemen or deputy sheriffs within comparable classes in California. Although the election showed that a large number of citizens supported highway patrolmen's efforts to solve their salary problem, it was not enough, and the initiative did not pass. However, all was not lost. AB 3801, the blockbuster CAHP-sponsored pay parity bill, was signed by Governor Reagan on September 17, 1974. It states that recommendations for the California Highway Patrol salary should be based on the estimated average salaries of some of the largest metropolitan departments in the state. This is instrumental in determining what parity for salary should be, even in negotiations today. It was one of the most significant pieces of legislation critical to the livelihoods of CHP officers ever passed. 1974 was a big year. The association sponsored 6 bills in the legislature during the year and was actively involved in 88. The Women Traffic Officer Project, or WTOP, a 2-year study to determine the feasibility of employing women as traffic officers, started in 1974. Women were also admitted as members of the CAHP for the first time. The membership then was 6,384, of which 24 were female. A new CHP publication made its debut in June 1974, the APB, Association Communication to Area Representatives called Area Rep Informers, also started that same year. In 1976, the current CHP Academy opened its doors, and today it continues to be a state-of-the-art training facility. In its center is the memorial fountain with the names of all fallen officers on small plaques, which are faithfully polished in a weekly ceremony. Ponch and John made their debut in Chips, the wildly popular TV show in 1977, which many officers later credited as the reason they became interested in working for the CHP. In 1979, the SERA Act passed, which was the beginning of collective bargaining. It allowed groups of employees to negotiate contracts for better pay benefits. Prior to that, the CAHP would lobby the legislature for pay and benefit increases with varying success. With collective bargaining in place, the CAHP negotiated with a representative of the governor's office. Even though the parity bill was passed in 1974, the recommended salary was never adopted, so CHP salaries fell far behind the other agencies. After a statewide coordinated effort in 1979 by CAHP members to voice their frustration, parity was finally taken up by the legislature. While the legislature agreed to the salary adjustment necessary in order to achieve parity, Governor Jerry Brown vetoed the legislation. That action led to one of the very few veto overrides by a legislature in California's history. Needless to say, the CHP got a 20.6% pay adjustment, and that action started the CAHP on a continuous path of working to maintain parity. As the world saw an increase in new technology in computers in the 1980s, costs associated with college increased significantly. The CAHP Foundation was formed in 1980 to provide scholarships to outstanding students who are dependents of members. The CAHP and the governor's office met for negotiations for the first time in 1982 to determine a contract and write a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU for short, which set the pay and benefits for CHP officers, always with the goal of watching out for the members now and protecting their benefits in the future. At the same time, cars were getting faster on California's freeways. The CHP wanted to demonstrate that their cars had the muscle and speed required to pursue performance cars, and Mustangs began being used by the CHP in 1982.
Because in a lot of places, the boss is back.
But now, it's wearing a badge.
Here is the flag of the United States.
In 1984, Los Angeles welcomed the world for the Olympics. The CHP coordinated the complex security for the large event, boosting its visibility among dignitaries, international athletes, and visitors. In 1995, the state police became part of the CHP, and they became members of the CAHP. Going into the 21st century, pay began to fall behind again, and the parity law was adjusted again in 2000. In that year, the CAHP and the state entered the first 5-year contract that guaranteed parity by its end. Also in 2000, the CAHP negotiated a 3% at 50 retirement formula for their members. This allowed a retirement based on 3% for every year worked and the ability to retire at age 50. Throughout the 2000s, pay adjustments were negotiated to recognize that officers are actually on duty through their lunch period and have to spend extra time to prepare before shift by putting on and maintaining protective equipment. In 2009, the CAHP was instrumental in establishing a mechanism to pre-fund retiree health care in a manner similar to the way pensions are funded. This benefit is also known as Other Post-Employment Benefits, or OPEB. The work of the CAHP led the way for other state employee labor unions to do the same. There were several attacks on pensions in 2012. A group known as California Pension Reform attempted to place pension reform on the ballot via the statewide initiative process. Their proposals would have placed all state employees in a 401k-style retirement plan in lieu of the defined benefit plan administered by CalPERS. Ultimately, the group withdrew those efforts due to a lack of funding. In fall 2012, Governor Brown and the legislature implemented pension reform for newly hired state workers. That pension reform took effect January 1, 2013, and it reduced the pension benefit formulas for all newly hired employees who, due to the fact they were not employees at the time the law was enacted, were not protected by collective bargaining. In 2019, in order to address unfounded liabilities in the CHP retirement account at CalPERS, CAHP negotiated for the state to provide supplemental funding for CHP pensions in the amount of $340 million in additional funding, specifically for CHP pensions over 4 years. CHP officers contributed 1% of additional salary towards this effort over the same 4-year period. In 2019 and 2020, and most likely continuing into the near future, there are many calls for changes to police use of force policies in California and throughout the United States. In response, the CAHP has worked with a consortium of law enforcement groups and reform activists on legislation to create and improve upon statewide uniformity in use of force policies for policing in California. The vast majority of the best practice changes to use of force laws that were implemented were already in use by the California Highway Patrol. Law enforcement has become an embattled occupation, and none of the CAHP leadership can think of a time in recent history when there has been so much tension associated with the work officers perform in the field. The CAHP is committed to make every effort to rise to this occasion and be a voice of reason and an advocate for all members and the very hard work officers continue to do in these uncertain times. 100 years of challenges met by 100 years of solutions. Using the knowledge of today coupled with the experience of yesterday, the CAHP is poised to continue building on its legacy of serving those who provide service to the public. So here's to another 100 years of serving California's finest.